Sir, she's here. The young hostess's voice trembled as she looked toward the admiral standing a few feet away. The admiral turned immediately. For a moment, the busy check-in area of the White House ceremony seemed to fall silent. My father was still standing beside me, proudly holding his VIP invitation. Only seconds earlier, he had been smirking. You weren't invited. Now, he looked confused. The admiral walked directly toward me, not toward my father, toward me. Several military officers standing nearby suddenly straightened their posture. The admiral extended his hand. Commander Emily Carter, he said warmly. We've been waiting for you. My father blinked. I could almost hear his thoughts racing. Waiting for me. The daughter he had spent most of his life overlooking. The daughter he had always considered second best. The daughter he never expected much from. I shook the admiral's hand. Thank you, sir. The admiral smiled. It's an honor to have you here. And just like that, the memory I'd spent decades trying to bury came rushing back. Because moments like this don't begin at the White House. They begin years earlier, usually in places nobody notices. In my case, it began in a small town in Virginia, a town with one stoplight, one grocery store, and one father who never wanted a daughter. At least that was how it often felt. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I was invisible inside my own family. My father wasn't a cruel man, at least not in the way people usually imagine. He never hit me. He never abandoned us. He worked hard, paid the bills, showed up every day. From the outside, he looked like a good father. The problem was what happened inside the house, especially after my younger brother Michael was born. Dad adored Michael. Everything changed when that little boy arrived. The way Dad looked at him, the way he spoke about him, the way his entire face lit up whenever Michael entered a room. Even as a little girl, I noticed the difference. Children always notice. Adults think they're hiding it. They aren't. I remember bringing home a perfect spelling test in 3rd grade. I was so excited. I ran into the kitchen holding the paper. Dad, look. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. Good job. Then he looked back at Michael. How was baseball practice, buddy? That was it. No celebration, no pride, no conversation, just good job. I stood there holding the paper, waiting, but nothing else came. Years later, I would realize that moment wasn't unusual. It was normal. The wall in our living room told the story better than words ever could. Michael's baseball trophies covered the shelves. His photographs filled the frames. His certificates hung proudly where every visitor could see them. There wasn't a single picture of my accomplishments. Not one. When relatives visited, Dad would proudly walk them through Michael's achievements. Future star athlete, he'd say. Meanwhile, I could be standing 3 FT away, and nobody asked about me. At first, I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe if I earned better grades, maybe if I worked harder, maybe if I achieved something extraordinary, maybe then Dad would finally see me. Children have a heartbreaking habit of blaming themselves for things they never caused. I learned that before I was old enough to fully understand why. When you're a child, you don't analyze family dynamics. You don't recognize favoritism or emotional neglect for what they are. You simply assume that if someone treats you differently, there must be something wrong with you. That was how I grew up. My older brother Michael could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. My father lit up around him in a way I rarely experienced myself. Every baseball game mattered. Every practice mattered. Every small accomplishment became family news. Meanwhile, I learned how to become invisible. Not intentionally, quietly, gradually. Like fading wallpaper, nobody notices until years later. The only person who truly saw me was my mother, Sarah Carter. My mother had the gentlest voice I'd ever heard. She wasn't dramatic or loud. She didn't command attention the way some people do. But somehow she understood people better than anyone else in our family combined. Especially me. One evening after Michael's baseball game, I sat alone in my bedroom staring at the floor, while the sound of my father's voice echoed faintly downstairs. He had spent the entire drive home praising Michael's performance. Every pitch, every hit, every play. I barely existed during that conversation. I was 12 years old enough to recognize disappointment, young enough to still hope things might change. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Emily? My mother's voice floated gently through the door. Can I come in? I nodded. She entered quietly carrying a mug of tea. The room smelled faintly like lavender from the lotion she always used. Even now, years later, that scent still reminds me of safety. Mom sat beside me on the bed, without speaking at first. She never rushed conversations. That was one of her gifts. She understood silence. After a few moments, she reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. You're hurting. It wasn't a question. It was simply true. I stared down at my hands. I'm fine. She smiled sadly. No, sweetheart, you're not. The tears came instantly. I hated crying, hated feeling weak. But somehow my mother always saw through every wall I tried building. He doesn't care about anything I do. The words barely escaped my mouth. Mom stayed quiet for a moment. I could tell she was choosing her response carefully. Finally, she sighed softly. Your father loves you. I looked up uncertainly. She continued before I could argue. But sometimes people carry old ideas they don't know how to let go of. What does that mean? She looked toward the window for a second before answering. It means he believes sons and daughters are different. I laughed bitterly. They are. No. Her voice remained calm, but firm. Not in the ways that matter. Then she took my hand. Emily, listen to me. I looked at her. One day you'll show people who you really are. At 12 years old, it sounded like one of those comforting things mothers say because they're supposed to. The kind of sentence that belongs on greeting cards. But my mother squeezed my hand tightly, and suddenly I realized something important. She truly believed it. Not hoped, believed. That realization stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Years passed. The difference between how my father treated Michael and how he treated me became impossible to ignore. Dad spent thousands supporting Michael's athletic dreams, travel teams, private coaching, new equipment, special camps. Whenever Michael wanted something related to baseball, money somehow appeared. When I needed something, the answer usually sounded different. We can't afford it. At 14, I started babysitting. At 15, I worked weekends. At 16, I bought my own school supplies. I tried not to complain, at least not out loud. But late at night, I sometimes wondered what it felt like to be chosen first, to walk into a room and immediately know you mattered, to receive support without needing to earn it first. Then, life delivered the hardest blow imaginable. The one person who always believed in me started getting sick. At first, my mother tried hiding it. She smiled through exhaustion, dismissed symptoms, pretended appointments were routine. But eventually, the truth became impossible to hide. Doctor visits became hospital visits. Hospital visits became treatments. Treatments became fear. I watched the strongest person I knew slowly grow weaker, and no matter how hard I prayed, I couldn't stop it. One evening, I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while machines hummed softly around us. Her grip felt weaker than before, but her eyes remained steady, certain. Promise me something. I immediately leaned closer. What? She squeezed my hand gently. Never let anyone decide your worth. Tears burned my eyes instantly. I promise. She smiled softly, the same smile that had carried me through every lonely moment of childhood. Then she whispered words that would follow me for the rest of my life. One day, they'll see who you really are. At the time, I thought she meant my father. I thought she meant my family. I didn't understand she meant something much bigger. 3 months before my high school graduation, my mother died. I was 17 years old. At that age, you're old enough to understand death is permanent, but not old enough to understand how life continues afterward. The morning of her funeral, our house felt unbearably quiet, despite being full of people. Relatives filled every room. Neighbors brought food. Church friends offered condolences. Everyone spoke in soft voices, as if loud sounds might break something fragile. But all I could think about was the fact that the one person who truly noticed me was gone. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. After the funeral, life appeared to move forward for everyone else. Dad buried himself in work. Michael buried himself in baseball, and I buried myself in school. Without my mother, the house changed. Not physically, emotionally. She had been the bridge connecting everyone together, the person who softened harsh conversations, the person who remembered birthdays, the person who made ordinary moments feel warm. Without her, every emotional distance became more obvious, especially the distance between my father and me. A month after her death, I found a letter hidden inside an old cedar chest. The envelope had my name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled opening it. The paper still carried the faint scent of her perfume. Inside was a short handwritten note. Most of it was simple encouragement, but one sentence changed my life forever. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I read those words repeatedly, at first through tears, then through determination, eventually through hope. I carried that letter everywhere for years, sometimes physically, always emotionally. Graduation arrived later that spring. Families celebrated proudly around me. Mine felt fractured. I remember walking across the stage searching instinctively for my mother in the crowd. For one brief second, I forgot she was gone. Then, reality returned all at once. The empty seat beside my father felt larger than the entire auditorium. I accepted my diploma while fighting tears. Afterward, relatives congratulated Michael on his latest sports accomplishment. Few people asked about my future. By then, I was used to it. College felt financially impossible. Most of our family's resources continued supporting Michael's athletic dreams. Mine were considered optional. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by scholarship applications, financial aid forms, essays, recommendation requests. Paperwork covered nearly every surface. Dad walked through the kitchen and glanced at the documents. "What are those?" "Scholarship applications." He nodded once. "That's probably your only chance." Not cruel, not encouraging, just factual. But some statements stay with you forever. For several minutes after he left the room, I stared at those papers wondering if maybe I should quit trying. Then I remembered my mother's letter, and I kept writing. Every night after work, every weekend, every spare moment. I applied for every scholarship I could find. Leadership programs, academic grants, community awards, opportunities I had never even heard of before. Months later, acceptance letters began arriving, one after another. Eventually, I had enough financial aid to attend college. Not because anyone handed me an opportunity, because I chased opportunities myself. College wasn't glamorous. Most students spent weekends partying or socializing. I spent mine working, waitressing, tutoring, stocking shelves, anything that paid bills. At first, I resented it. Then slowly, I realized something important. Hardship had given me an advantage. Many people learn discipline because someone expects greatness from them. I learned discipline because nobody did. That changes a person. It teaches resilience. It teaches independence. Most importantly, it teaches you how to keep going without applause. During my second year of college, Michael suffered a serious shoulder injury. Suddenly, the baseball future my father had built his identity around started collapsing. For the first time, I saw fear in my father. Not fear for me, fear for Michael. Fear for the future he imagined for his son. Meanwhile, I was quietly building a future nobody expected. Nobody except my mother. One afternoon, while organizing old photographs, I found a picture of her sitting on our front porch, smiling directly at the camera. I sat staring at it for nearly an hour. I imagined what she would say if she could see me continuing forward despite everything. I think she'd be proud. Not because of awards or achievements, because I kept going. That thought carried me through difficult years. By the time I graduated college, something inside me had changed. I no longer needed constant validation, not because the wounds disappeared, because I finally understood my worth existed independently from other people's recognition. Shortly after graduation, an opportunity appeared that changed everything. United States Navy recruiting. The first time I walked into a recruiting office, I wasn't looking for adventure. I was looking for stability, purpose, a future. The recruiter asked me a simple question. "What are you hoping to accomplish?" Nobody had ever asked me that seriously before. I thought carefully before answering. "I want to earn something nobody can take away from me." The recruiter smiled slowly. "That's a good reason." A few months later, I raised my right hand and took the oath. My father didn't attend. He wasn't against my decision. He simply wasn't interested enough to rearrange his schedule. Michael showed up because he happened to be available that afternoon. Dad called later that evening. "Be careful." That was the entire conversation. Still, sitting alone in my apartment afterward, I smiled while staring at the small navy pin in my hand, because my mother would have understood what it represented. Not just a career, freedom. Training was harder than anything I'd experienced. The Navy didn't care about childhood disappointments. It didn't care about favoritism. It didn't care about excuses. It cared about results. And strangely enough, I loved that. For the first time in my life, expectations were simple. Work hard, improve, earn respect. Nobody compared me to Michael. Nobody asked whether daughters mattered less than sons. Performance spoke for itself. That felt liberating. Of course, not everyone welcomed me immediately. Some people underestimated me because I was young. Others underestimated me because I was a woman. Eventually, I stopped trying to argue with people who doubted me. Instead, I focused on becoming excellent. When others relaxed, I prepared. When others complained, I studied. When others doubted me, I worked harder. Slowly, opportunities began appearing. Promotions followed. Leadership responsibilities followed. Recognition followed. Years passed. Assignments changed. Cities changed. People changed. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to prove my father wrong. That surprised me most. For years, I thought success would feel like revenge. Instead, success felt like freedom. The freedom to stop carrying old pain. One evening after a long day, I returned home and found a large envelope from Washington waiting in my mailbox. I assumed it was routine paperwork. Instead, inside was an official invitation recognizing exceptional military leadership and public service. The ceremony would take place at the White House. For several minutes, I simply stared at the page. Then my eyes drifted toward my mother's framed photograph sitting nearby. I smiled through tears. "Mom," they finally noticed. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what she had meant all those years ago. One day, they'll see who you really are. She had always known, long before anyone else, long before awards, long before promotions, long before Washington. She saw it when I was still a heartbroken little girl sitting on the edge of my bed, believing I wasn't enough, and because she believed in me before the world did, I eventually learned how to believe in myself too.